It's the case of 12-year-old Brad Bolino, who went missing in the spring of 1972 and was found dead 4 days later. Brad Bolino's body was discovered on April 4th, 1972 in a dumpster behind what was then the Isley store in the Boardman Plaza. This is WKBN news footage from that time. The Porchlight Project, which focuses on cold cases, reported last year that Boardman police had sent out a DNA sample to help with the Brad Bolino case.
The person responsible for taking the life of a young boy in Boardman, Ohio, didn't run. He didn't hide. He stayed. For decades, he lived among the same neighbors, drove the same roads, and said good morning to people who had no idea who he really was. This isn't a story about a stranger who vanished into the dark. It's a story about someone who never left. And it would take 51 years and a thread of DNA thinner than a human hair for a small town to finally uncover the truth. In 1972, Boardman was the kind of place where nobody locked their doors. Kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, and that was the only clock that mattered. Parents didn't worry. Nothing bad happened in Boardman. That's what everyone believed, right up until the night it stopped being true. Brad Bolino was born there on April 7th, 1959. He was the youngest of 4 kids, the baby of the family, small for his age, with a face people described as sweet and open. His mother worked as a buyer for a clothing store. His father worked the steel mills, as half the men in that part of Ohio did. Brad wasn't the kind of kid who faded into a room. He was the one with the idea, the one who talked his friends into things. His best friend was a boy named Don Templeman. They'd been inseparable for years. 6th grade classmates, baseball teammates, with Don's own father as their coach. Don threw the pitches. Brad caught them. After practice, more nights than not, Brad ended up at Don's house for dinner because his own parents worked long hours and the Templeman table always had room for one more. That was Easter weekend, 1972. No school on Friday, so the 2 boys had the whole day to themselves. They didn't have anywhere to be. They just walked. Around the neighborhood, past the shops, killing time the way 12-year-olds do when summer feels close enough to touch. That's when they noticed the van. Brown, nothing special about it, except that they kept seeing it, once at the shopping plaza, then again a few blocks later, then a 3rd time. At first they laughed about it, made jokes about the creepy guy following 2 kids around town. But the jokes got quieter each time the van showed up again. Eventually, one of them said it out loud, "Let's just go home." They picked up the pace, they didn't look back. They ended up at Don's house like they had 100 times before. Don's mother was sick that night. Brad's own parents were working, so there was no ride waiting for him when it came time to leave. Just a 3-mile walk he'd made plenty of times, in daylight and in the dark, on a bike and on foot. His father told him to be home by 9. At 7:30, Brad said goodbye to his best friend and stepped out the door. Nobody who loved him would ever see him alive again. He walked out into a spring evening that felt like every other one before it. Quiet streets. Porch lights are starting to come on. A 3-mile walk that should have taken less than an hour. He'd made this walk so many times that nobody thought twice about letting him go alone. That was the whole point of growing up in a town like Boardman. You were allowed to walk home in the dark and nothing was supposed to happen to you. 9 o'clock came and went. No Brad. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, hours had already slipped by unnoticed. Everybody assuming he was somewhere else, with somebody else, safe. That's how these nights work. Nobody panics right away. Nobody wants to be the one who overreacts. Then a call went out. Boardman police started searching that same night. They walked the route Brad should have taken, street by street, yard by yard. Neighbors joined in, flashlights swept through bushes and behind garages. Nothing turned up. No jacket, no shoe. No sign that a boy had ever walked down that road at all. The search stretched into the next day, then the day after that. A town that had never had to think about danger was suddenly combing every inch of itself, looking for a 12-year-old boy who had simply stepped outside and disappeared. Somewhere out there was an answer. Nobody in Boardman had it yet. 4 days. That's how long it would take before anyone knew what had happened to Brad Bolino. 4 days of his family waiting by the phone. 4 days of Don Templeman replaying that walk in his head, wondering if he should have offered to go with him. 4 days of a town telling itself he'd probably just wandered off and would turn up any minute now. He didn't turn up on his own. Someone was going to find him, and when they did, the town that never locked its doors was going to learn exactly what had been walking its streets that whole time. Paul Smith lifted the lid off the dumpster behind Isley's dairy store and saw a pair of sneakers sticking out of the trash. Striped sneakers. A kid's sneakers. For 1 second, his brain refused to understand what he was looking at. Then it did. It was April 4th, 1972. 4 days since Brad Bolino walked out of his best friend's house and never came home. Paul was just doing his morning route, collecting garbage behind the Boardman Plaza, the same as any other Tuesday. Nothing about that morning was supposed to be different. Then he pulled back the trash bags and found a boy's body underneath them. The evidence made it immediately clear that Brad's life had been violently and tragically taken. Whoever was responsible didn't just end Brad's life. They left him behind in the exact place he used to walk past with his best friend, on the way to look at rocks in the gift shop window. Police needed someone to confirm it was really him. They called a young officer named Tony DiPolito, who worked vice for the Youngstown Police Department. Tony drove to the scene, not knowing what he was about to see. And then he looked down into the dumpster and recognized his own cousin. He had to be the one to identify him. Then he had to be the one who drove to his aunt and uncle's house and told them their youngest child was dead. Years later, he'd say it plainly. You're never prepared for something like that. You just do it. Investigators assumed Brad had been missing for 4 full days, held somewhere the entire time. Then the autopsy came back, and it changed everything they thought they knew. His last dinner was still in his stomach, barely digested, the chicken and pineapple he'd eaten at Don's house the night he left. That meant Brad wasn't taken and held for days. He'd lost his life within hours of walking out that door. Somewhere on that 3-mile walk home, in the first hour of darkness, someone was already waiting. There was something else the autopsy found, or rather, something it didn't find. No bruises on his arms, no scratches, no sign that Brad fought back at all. For a boy described by everyone who knew him as fearless, as the one who came up with the risks instead of running from them, that silence in the evidence was its own kind of horror. Medical experts would later explain how that was possible. The perpetrator utilized a method that completely incapacitated Brad almost instantly. He was given no opportunity to defend himself and no time to call out for help, no time to fight, no time to scream. Whoever did this to Brad didn't stumble into it. They knew exactly what they were doing and exactly how fast it would work. That single detail turned this from a crime of chaos into something colder, something practiced. Boardman police started building a list. Over the following months, 4 names kept surfacing. A man neighborhood kids called Old Bob, known for his highly inappropriate and predatory interactions with local youth. A security guard at the shopping plaza with an unsettling obsession with police uniforms, who'd bought a car built to look like a cruiser. A movie theater projectionist known for targeting young boys in the area. A man working in a pizza shop a few blocks away has a similar reputation. 4 men, 4 sets of eyes, investigators watched for years. Officers questioned them. Officers followed them. Not one of them was ever charged. And here's what nobody in Boardman knew yet in 1972. The man they should have been looking at wasn't on that list at all. The department kept working, but it was a small-town force built for small-town problems, and this was something else entirely. Boxes of evidence piled up with no real system to organize them. Leads got written on index cards and buried under new ones. A $2,000 reward went up for information. Nobody claimed it. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. The 4 names on that list stayed suspects, and nothing more. Forever circled, never confirmed. Somewhere in Boardman, the man who actually killed Brad Bolino kept living his life. He kept his job. He kept his routine. He was never on anybody's list. He was never even a name investigators considered. 4 suspects. Years of leads. A town that refused to stop looking. And still, somehow, this case was about to go silent for the next 30 years. If this story has you hooked so far, drop a like below. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now for you. And if you're into more solved cold cases like this one, we've linked a few more in the description. Go check them out. Now, let's get back to the case. Not long after the funeral, Don's family packed up their house and left Boardman for good. They moved to Tennessee. Don never talked about that night again. Not to reporters, not to friends, not for almost 30 years. The boy who watched his best friend walk out the door for the last time grew into a man who carried that walk with him everywhere and told almost nobody. Boardman moved on too, the way towns do. New families moved in. Kids who weren't even born in 1972 grew up walking those same streets, never knowing what happened on one of them. The case got boxed up, literally, stacks of paper and evidence sitting in storage, untouched for years at a time. Almost everyone stopped thinking about Brad Bolino. Almost everyone. 2 detectives never let it go. Jack Nichols and Bob Rupp kept pulling those boxes back out, year after year, going through the same names, the same dead ends, hoping something new would jump out at them. Nothing ever did. Then, around the year 2000, Don was at Disney World with his own wife and kids. While they splashed around in the hotel pool, his phone rang. It was a Boardman detective. Nobody from that department had spoken to him since he was 12 years old. He sat alone in that hotel room for almost an hour, going through every detail of that night again, while his family had no idea where he'd disappeared to. That phone call is what put Brad's case back on someone's desk. Not new evidence, not a tip. Just 2 detectives refusing to let a boy stay forgotten. In 2001, they went further than anyone had before. They exhumed Brad's grave. Investigators pulled DNA straight from his remains and compared it to evidence still sitting on his clothes from the night he died. What they found confirmed something they'd suspected for years, but never been able to prove. The DNA on his clothing wasn't his. It belonged to someone else, someone who had been there in the dark with him. For the first time in almost 30 years, there was real, physical proof of the killer. Not a suspect, not a theory. An actual genetic fingerprint. Sitting in a lab, waiting to be matched to a name, they ran it through CODIS, the National DNA Database, fully expecting an answer. Nothing came back. Ohio had only just joined the national system. The database was still young, still full of gaps, still missing thousands of profiles that should have been in it. Brad's killer wasn't in there. His profile just floated in an empty system. A ghost with no name attached to it, waiting for a database that didn't exist yet to catch up. So Nichols and Rupp kept working anyway. They re-interviewed old suspects. They chased new tips that led nowhere. Rupp said it himself, years later. Ever since the day he stood at that dumpster and watched them pull Brad's body out, he thought about that boy every single day of his life. Not some days. Every day. For decades. That's not a detective doing a job. That's a man who never stopped carrying a dead child home in his mind, long after everyone else had let go. Years kept passing. The DNA sat there, untouched, unmatched. A perfect piece of evidence with nowhere to go. Then, in 2018, something changed everywhere in America, not just in Boardman. A killer in California, one who'd terrorized the state for decades, got caught using a method nobody had tried at this scale before. Investigators didn't search a criminal database. They searched genealogy websites, the same ones ordinary people use to find long-lost cousins and build family trees. Boardman detectives took Brad's DNA profile and pointed that same technology at it. For the first time in 46 years, a face started to form. Not a photograph, not a name, a shape, fair skin, freckles, brown or hazel eyes, family roots tracing back to Welsh ancestry, generations deep, a real person, built out of nothing but genetic fragments and a family tree with hundreds of branches spreading out in every direction. Somewhere on that tree was the man who murdered Brad Bolino. Investigators just had to find the right branch and follow it all the way down to one living person. If they could find him at all, and if they did, there was no telling whether he'd still be alive to answer for what he did. One branch, then another eliminated. Investigators spent 4 years working backward through a family tree with hundreds of names on it, crossing off relative after relative, chasing a killer who didn't know he was even being hunted. It cost the township $29,000. Every dollar of it went toward narrowing down one man's identity. Decades after everyone assumed this case was unsolvable, investigators would trace a branch, collect a sample, wait for results, and hit a wall. Then they'd go back and try another branch. Some relatives gave DNA the moment they were asked. Others had to be tracked down first. Piece by piece, generation by generation, the tree got smaller. Finally, they reached the most recent branch. A living relative agreed to give a sample. When the results came back, that relative was horrified to learn what their own family might be connected to. The DNA was a 98.2% match. The man behind Brad's murder had a name: Joseph Norman Hill. He wasn't a drifter who blew through town and vanished. He wasn't a stranger who'd never be found because he'd never stayed anywhere long enough. In 1972, Hill lived on Shadyside Drive, less than 5 miles from Brad's own house. He was 32 years old, married. He drove a truck for a bottled water company, delivering to homes all over the township. No criminal record, nothing that would have put him on anyone's radar, nothing that would have made a single neighbor look at him twice. For decades, people in Boardman had pictured Brad's killer as someone from outside, a drifter, a stranger passing through who got away clean because he never had roots there to begin with. That theory made a kind of sense. It also let everyone breathe a little easier. A monster like that couldn't have been one of them. He was one of them. Hill could have passed Brad's mother in the grocery store. He could have delivered water bottles to a house 2 streets over from where Brad's family grieved every single day for 51 years. He lived his entire ordinary life inside the same 5-mile radius as a family he had destroyed, and nobody ever connected the two. That's the part that doesn't sit right. Not that a monster existed. Monsters exist everywhere. It's that this one got to keep being ordinary. He kept his job. He kept his marriage. Nobody ever pulled him aside and asked him a single hard question. In 1978, 6 years after Brad died, Hill moved his family to California. He settled outside Los Angeles and just kept living. His wife died in 1993. He had almost no other family, which is part of why this case took so long to crack. There was barely a tree to search in the first place. Investigators finally had a name, a face taking shape after decades of nothing, and then they found the one detail that undid everything. Joseph Norman Hill died in July of 2019. Natural causes in an assisted living facility in California. He was cremated shortly after. Read that again. He died in 2019. That is the exact same year Boardman police finally started using genetic genealogy on Brad's case. The same year, the technology that would eventually identify him was just getting off the ground. For one brief window, the science that could have caught Joseph Hill while he was alive to face what he did actually existed. It just didn't get pointed at him in time. He was gone before anyone ever came looking, cremated before there was any DNA left to test directly against his own body. No trial, no handcuffs, no moment where he had to sit in a courtroom and hear Brad's name read out loud in front of the family he destroyed. He simply died, quietly, the way anyone does. No consequences ever found him, not because investigators failed, because time ran out first, by a matter of months. On January 24, 2023, Boardman's police chief stood at a podium in front of cameras and said the name out loud for the first time: Joseph Norman Hill. He explained the DNA match. He explained the 4-year search. He explained that after 51 years, Brad Bolino's family finally had an answer. The county prosecutor stood next to him and said something that mattered just as much. If Hill had been alive, there was enough evidence to take this case to a grand jury, enough to charge him, enough, almost certainly, to convict him. Almost. That word is the whole tragedy of this case, folded into one syllable. Brad's family was in that room. They didn't get up and speak. They didn't need to. They sat quietly, together, and let the room hold what 51 years of waiting finally sounded like. Afterward, some of them walked over to shake the hands of the 2 detectives who had refused, for decades, to let their son become a name nobody remembered. There was no trial. There was no sentencing. There was only a name finally spoken, and a family finally allowed to stop wondering. But naming Hill didn't just close Brad's case. It reopened a door nobody expected. Because once you know a man's name, once you know exactly where he lived, and exactly which years he spent walking around Boardman like everyone else, you start asking what else he might have touched while he was there. One file rose straight to the top of the pile. The moment Boardman named Joseph Norman Hill publicly, investigators started pulling every unsolved death from his years in that township. Anyone who died young, anyone whose case never quite sat right, anyone whose file had a question mark still attached to it. They didn't have to look far. One case had been sitting there for 48 years, filed away under a cause of death nobody had ever fully believed. David Evans was 13 years old. In January of 1975, he went missing in Boardman, less than a mile from where Brad's body had been found 3 years earlier. 6 days later, they found him. At the time, investigators ruled it a natural cause. David was diabetic, and the official story was that he'd slipped into a coma and died from it, alone, before anyone could help him. Case closed, no suspect, no further questions. Except David's body bore signs of physical trauma and distinct marks that occurred post-mortem, details that a medical event alone could never explain. A diabetic coma couldn't explain the physical trauma found on David's body. Investigators noticed clear signs of foul play that a medical event simply couldn't cause. Someone had to have moved him, handled him, done something to him after he died that a coma alone could never explain. Investigators back in 1975 noticed those details. They just didn't have anywhere to take them. In 2023, with Hill's name freshly attached to Brad's case, Boardman's current coroner went back and looked at David's file with new eyes. He reclassified the death. Natural causes became homicide, decades after the fact. Then they tested what evidence remained from David's clothing against Hill's DNA profile. It matched. The same man who killed Brad Bolino in 1972 had killed David Evans too, 3 years later, less than a mile away. 2 boys, same township. The same killer was walking freely between both deaths, going home afterward, showing up for work the next morning like nothing had happened. On June 8, 2023, Ohio's Attorney General stood at a podium in Boardman and said a word out loud that nobody had used publicly before. Serial killer. A sitting Attorney General, on the record, naming a dead truck driver from a quiet Ohio suburb exactly that. 2 confirmed victims. A man who had lived among his neighbors for 6 years after Brad died, killing again before he ever left the state. There's one more name that comes up when people talk about this case. Thomas Baird, 15 years old, beaten and left for dead in Boardman back in 1970, 2 years before Brad. For a while, people wondered if he belonged on this same list. He doesn't. Investigators looked hard at Thomas's case, and the pattern doesn't match. His death looked like a group assault, not the kind of controlled solitary act that killed Brad and David. It would be easy to fold Thomas into this story anyway, to make it feel bigger, more complete. That would be a lie. Not every unsolved death connects. Sometimes the honest answer is simply that nobody knows yet, and forcing a connection that isn't there does a disservice to a boy who deserves his own truth, not someone else's ending. So here's where this case actually stands. Joseph Norman Hill was never arrested, never charged, never sat across from a prosecutor or heard. A jury read a verdict. He died quietly in an assisted living facility in California, cremated, completely unaware that anyone was closing in on him. There will never be a trial. There will never be a sentence. In the eyes of the law, this case ends without the one thing every family in this position wants most. But something did get won here, even without a courtroom. 2 families spent decades not knowing. Now they know. Brad's family finally has a name to attach to 51 years of unanswered questions. David's family finally has the truth about what really happened to their son, instead of a diagnosis that never fully made sense. Detectives Jack Nichols and Bob Rupp spent years carrying this case alone, going through the same boxes, the same names, the same silence, long after most people had stopped believing it would ever be solved. They don't have to carry it by themselves anymore. Rupp said he thinks about the day he stood at that dumpster every single day of his life. Now, at least, he gets to think about it knowing the answer. The case stays open. Hill lived for years after leaving Ohio, first in Los Angeles, later elsewhere in California. Nobody knows what those years held, whether there were other boys. Other families are still waiting for a phone call that hasn't come yet. Brad Bolino left his best friend's house on a Friday night in 1972, expecting to be home by 9. He never made it. It took 51 years, 2 detectives who refused to quit, and a piece of technology nobody had even imagined back then to finally say his killer's name out loud. That's what this story leaves behind. Not justice, just the truth, finally spoken, for two boys who waited far too long to be believed. Hill will never face a trial, but this story isn't fully closed, because nobody knows what happened in those years after he moved to California, whether there were other boys, other families still waiting on a call that never came. So, here's what we want to ask you. If you lived in Boardman and found out your neighbor had been hiding something like this for decades, do you think you'd ever be able to trust the same way again? And when a killer dies before he's ever charged, is that justice to you or just an answer? Let us know in the comments. If you think Hill may have hurt someone else along the way, out in California, or anywhere in between, drop your theory below. Someone out there might have lived exactly where he did. If this story stayed with you, if you want Brad and David to be remembered, not forgotten, hit like on this video. Drop their names in the comments just so they're written somewhere. And if you want more cases like this one, cold cases that finally get answers, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.